Episode 36, Fat, All That Moral Weight. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be continuing the look at fat in the 17th century. Last week, it was prestige rankings. This week, it's the moral implications of something that is essential for life, but also causes moral crises in America, both for the earliest small collection of colonies and in its modern incarnation. Want to see the beginnings of some of our modern food conundrums? Well, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know for this week's episode, it will be less about food than normal. Because fat and fatness take up such a large slice of modern American public thought and discourse, I feel it's important to dig back a little bit at those foundations. So this week, I will look at some of the philosophical underpinnings that were guiding the people who would lay down a fair amount of the moral and political groundwork for the future USA through the religious stances. So as long as you're up for a discussion on philosophy as related to food and can live with some radical oversimplifications of topics that people spent lifetimes elucidating down to the level of theoretical hair splitting, continue on. In the 17th century, fat was not a moral issue for the vast majority of people in North America, or any of the Americas at this point. But for those few where it was a moral issue, they were, let's face it, super obnoxious about making it an issue for everyone. And these same people were into writing their opinions down and even copying them hundreds or thousands of times and spreading them around. Oh, that printing press. Just getting in there and disrupting everyone else who was just living their lives with largely oral traditions. Sheesh. Every time a new method of disseminating information comes along, things get real messy and uncomfortable for a bit. Anyway, the people who had a whole bunch of moral issues with fat, instead of just eating it as a food like the rest of the world, it turns out they were these same groups of religious refugees fleeing to the shores of the New World. Fleeing, you ask? Well, yes. For some, because life was just uncomfortable, but for others, they were actually in bad trouble with their governments. Let me back up and explain. Part of what was going on with all these English, Protestant, Puritan, separatist, sectarian types, and some of the various other foreign Protestant weirdos, many were coming to the New World in search of a spot to build their new Jerusalem, or their shining city on a hill, free from the evils of the old world. And one of the main evils they were escaping was popery. That is, the Western Catholic Christian Church, based in Rome and run by the Pope and his bureaucracy. Why was this happening? Lots of reasons, but to once again wildly oversimplify an historical trend of hundreds of years in the making, Bibles in not Latin were appearing all over Europe, and especially in English. In England. Hey, printing press, what you doing? Nothing. Just creating Christian splinter cells all over Europe. You? There are different versions of the story that happened all over Christendom. But the version we're concerned about is mainly what happened in England and then Britain, as well as northwestern Europe around the 16th century. So Henry VIII upsets the apple cart in 16th century England, breaking the Western Catholic Church's claim to be the only way to talk to the Christian God in England. Once that happens, there are questions, especially since it opens the door for the first official English language Bible, known as the Great Bible, to be translated and published for this newly created Anglican Church. Once you start the splinter groups, guess what? It goes fractal. This exposed many non-clerical people to reading the words of God with their own eyes in their own language for the first time, ever. As with our modern access to things like, 3D printing and DNA splicing, these local language or translated Bibles caused more than a few people to question the need for all these layers of organizational bureaucracy between them and how they thought the information should be used. For English speakers, the Geneva Bible was the first widely distributed text. It was mechanically printed rather than hand-copied. It divided the text into verses. It had cross-referencing and marginalia to help readers access the content more thoroughly, as well as introductions, summaries, maps, tables, and illustrations. It also notably used the colloquial English of the 16th century. So when read by a reasonably literate person, or read aloud to generally educated and intelligent regular people, because education then did not always mean literacy, the ideas could be parsed and generally grasped. Sure, it would sound formal and odd to us, the way Shakespeare does now, but it was in the rhythms and idioms of that time. Oh, and for what it's worth, Shakespeare's writing shows he referenced a Geneva Bible. This Geneva Bible was in conflict with the earlier Great Bible English language version sanctioned by the Anglican Church. Yes, the church Henry VIII started so he could get a divorce and marry Queen Elizabeth I's mother. It was all so soap opera. Real Husbands of the British Isles, right? And it was called the Geneva Bible, since that's where it was translated, written, edited, and first printed by a group of English religious dissidents. Anyway, religious slap fights all around, lots of people are harassed, imprisoned, tortured, and some are killed for owning and or hanging out with Bibles, sermons, and prayer books that were either too Protestant and sometimes too Catholic. Henry dies. His daughter Mary Tudor, or Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, tries to restore the Catholic Church, but then she dies. Then Elizabeth becomes queen and affirms the Anglican Church. Long reign, never marries, Spanish Armada, yada, yada, yada. Then in 1603, after her 44 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth dies. The child of Mary, Queen of Scots, also known as Mary Stuart, and her second husband, Lord Darnley, ascends to the throne and rules as James I and IV, finally uniting the Scottish and English crowns. So at last, they aren't just the English, now we have the British. Blah, blah, blah. So King James decides to solve the whole Catholic, Anglican, Protestant mess by officially sponsoring his own Bible in 1611 to end all the squabbling, which I'm sure you believe it totally did. Just the way the 15th century Treaty of Tordesillas ended the squabbling between the Spanish and the Portuguese and the rest of Europe when it came to colonizing the world. The end. Yeah? No. So here we are in the nonconformist regions of England. People sure were pretty willing to go to church the right number of times, so 1 to 2 times on Monday through Saturday and 4 to 8 hour sessions on Sunday. But which church? And is it 1 time or 2 times on weekdays? And in what language? Local English or Holy Latin? The possibility of English scripture created questions for people about this need for God to be filtered through a pope and archbishops and bishops and priests and deacons and so on and so on and so on, before what he said got to them, and possibly more importantly, what they said got back to God. So some people wanted like max 1 to 3 layers, but several wanted to go back to the personal, direct line to God, which gets us exactly why the Pilgrims were in big trouble with the English government and had booked it to Leiden in the Netherlands. In the 16th and 17th century, the royalty our story cares about were ruling under the divine right theory of government, which meant rejecting a church also meant rejecting the sovereign power of that country. So being against the church also put one on the outs with the government. Sometimes this meant you just got cut off from the ability to do, say, certain jobs, live certain places, or own certain types of stuff. If you were considered even more obnoxious or dangerous than that, you might be exiled, banished, or even arrested, and possibly tortured and or executed in a variety of gruesome ways. As a result, different groups of religious refugees of different stripes and creeds began shifting around Europe. When the New World opened up, for a certain type of person, it seemed like the perfect chance to start over. And the thing just about every single one of these New World seekers agreed on was that the Pope and his imitators were a big, fat problem. Amongst the finer doctrinal and translation-based objections, there was one issue they could all get mad about together: the tie between wealth and access to God. The opulent churches, monasteries, convents, and other religious houses of the Catholic Church rubbed these people very raw. And one dependable sign that a person was living an opulent life, likely stealing the bread out of the mouths of the hard-working poor, was a person dressing fancy, living in an opulent style, and being fat. The fat friar, fat monk, fat priest, fat abbess, fat nun, fat courtier, and fat prostitute were all characters used to show the idleness, the foolishness, the loose libidinousness, the licentiousness, and the evil inherent in the old ways of the old world. Peasants were starving as golden chapels were being built. Indulgences, that is, buying one's way out of the wages of sin, were on their way out, but getting blessings from the clergy if you donated a painting, some land, nice altar cloths, or whatever was definitely still going on, and would usually get you a blessing and paper over all sorts of sins and crimes, regardless of whether someone was a murderer, adulterer, usurer, bastard, or even a blasphemer. So the movement to separate from the state-sanctioned churches and to found a new church and community that was pure from within were the goals of many of these sects. The group from England that we now know in the U.S. as the Pilgrims saw themselves as separatist Congregationalists. That is, they saw no hope for the Anglicans. They had separated, and they saw no need for a bishop to talk to God for them. A pastor would lead worship, speak sermons, and lead the flock, but each member of the church could speak directly to or commune with God. Incidentally, this meant that communion was not offered at the hands of a priest. Bread and wine were not transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. Rather, each congregant partook of the bread and wine with their own hands and simply participated in the celebration of the Last Supper. The differences go on. No pictures of Christ and Mary, that was idolatry. No saints, that's false idols and the worship of others than the jealous God of the Old Testament, and so on. The ultimate goal was a stripped-down, pure, and proudly plain, direct interaction with God. Over time, even the simplest and most innocent tokens would be questioned. Fresh in-season flowers picked on the way to church, playing music on instruments, or bathing and changing clothes before special days would each, at times, be declared questionable gestures. Adding to this consciously and even ostentatiously stripped-down faith, the rigors of exile abroad and then over the ocean created a series of situations that produced an even more hardened faith. In a variety of ways, the early New England colonies resembled modern attempts at libertarian utopias. They all start with the idea that all that's holding them back from the awesome and pure ideas they have in their heads, the perfect society, is the old established structures and laws of the polluted old world. But just about the very second they get away from saying what they won't do and have to start making positive plans and following through on them, trouble starts. For our separatists, terrible transportation, food shortages, lack of buy-in from all the participants, and a risk of collapse due to money-making ventures not working out all nearly doomed the Plymouth Colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and several of the other New England offshoots. Starvation, disease, and conflict with the local Native American populations all came close to collapsing the ventures, and did end a few others that are much less well known to history. But a handful of ventures did survive, despite losing half to 3/4 or nearly all of their original populations. And the survival depended on working relentlessly and even kicking out those who would not work hard enough. The conclusion repeatedly reached, seen in sermons, diary entries, and later recollections, was that survival of the community, was dependent on continued hard work and continued efforts to construct an adequately pure community pleasing to the God they envisioned. When it came to good and evil, there were definitely blacks and whites in the way the world worked. Children were not born innocent, but pre-stained with original sin. Thus, babies who died before they could be baptized went not to purgatory, but to the eternal damnation of hell. Sin was not a separate thing that could be sloughed off by prayer or repentance. Humans all started bad. They could be taught to be good through a series of effort and punishments of others, but the entirety of life was littered with temptations, and each individual was responsible for keeping evil at bay for themselves and the community they lived in. Thus, much of what we as modern humans might do as common human decency or in response to exhaustion was seen as inviting in sin and dooming the community. Those who were not working hard enough had to be shunned and punished. Those who were speaking and even thinking improper and impure ideas had to be found and shunned and punished. Even offering kindness to those that were being shunned, punished, or exiled was seen as inviting in the devil. So those exhibiting compassion became suspect and possible candidates for further shunning and punishment. As a result, it became important, even imperative, to be able to identify who is practicing or harboring evil. In a time and culture where all unknown and mysterious things were attributed to God or the devil, things like illness, mental or physical, were attributed to God's displeasure or the work of Satan. Accident, poor weather, farm animal mishaps, and disobedient children could and were often attributed to divine displeasure or interference of evil forces. As a result, copious sermons and letters of driving out the evil in the community were written, preached, and spread. Not working hard enough and long enough became an affront to God. Memories about fat clergy and fat monastics stealing bread and meat from the peasants and lolling about in idleness became a boogeyman. The way to stop the devil was to give him no space. So constant occupation became the way to keep temptation and the devil at bay. Since a constant refrain at this point was that some are called to be servants and others are called to be masters, it was the Christian duty of the masters to keep the servants occupied. This became a regular refrain as so many of the servants in the Americas were coming explicitly from the lower classes in England, and even worse, the jails and the criminal classes. So the danger of them being devil-ridden was ever so much higher. As a result, they needed to be busy at all times. I'll go into this dynamic in detail in the last episode of the Season 1 series on housekeeping. So with these nearly constant exhortations to be on the watch for wickedness unpleasing to God and to plug up holes that invited in the devil, people had to develop methods to identify stains on the purity of the community. Suspicious moles were always a dependable sign of devil consorting, but what else? What was a visual signal someone was being lazy? Fatness. And what were all those evil fat Catholics always eating? Greasy meats, decadent sauces, fatted calves. Shiny, greasy chins and fingers were always a sign that someone was being indulgent. So already, fat particularly, and food generally, were being given moral weight and restricted by class. The class structure early on in the 17th century New England colonies came down to saints and strangers. Were you among the elect that had been chosen by God to get into heaven? Or were you among the rabble that, regardless of what you did, were consigned to hell? As a result, restricting how and what one ate to prove sanctity was part of the early New England colonial fabric, as did judging people by how much of the day they were busy at work. People would display that they were among the elect by showing that they were the master of their appetites. They would survive famine, and even in times of plenty, would engage in food restrictions, often specifically eschewing oil animal fat, and cream and butter as decadent. And as a saint, a member of the elect, many would consider it a duty, a calling, to be a master over weaker souls. As a result, the restriction of food, or at the very least the judging of the food eaten by the lower sorts, was a very common activity. From the earliest times, by many of the most prolific writers in future America, the amount you were eating, what you were eating, how constantly busy you were, and whether you appeared fat or not were all moral issues. Was this everyone? No. And in the 17th century, there was wide regional variation. The further one was from the religious New England hotbeds, the vilification of luxurious eating and fatness fell away. But these attitudes were held and passed on and written down and printed in books and pamphlets that laid down the idea that food should go to the deserving. And the deserving were those that were visibly busy. The unworthy might be denied food, and certainly the best food, which in those days was acknowledged to include the luxury of fat. And a clear signal of being unworthy, other than being, say, diseased or deformed, which had been brought on clearly by one's own ungodliness, or possibly the ungodliness of those around you, most likely your parents or children, was to appear fat, for that was a sign of your sloth, and then any indignity might be heaped upon you. This idea of food being good and evil, of our food choices being good and evil, pure and impure, and of our bodies being signs of internal or community good and evil, or purity and impurity, were woven into the fabric of this country from the very start. Fat is pleasurable to eat, and it is relatively simple to separate out. For so many of the religious schismatics who fled to the British colonies in the 17th century, pleasure was problematic. And denial of pleasure to oneself or to others was an important element of community purification of these groups. So the practice of skimming milk and the sequestering of fat from groups of people who didn't deserve it, and shaming those who did eat it joyfully, all worked their way into the language and practice of 17th century colonists, especially in New England. Now, is this entirely the root of our modern obsession with fat and the shaming of fat people? No. But it did prepare the ground that would allow these ideas to grow and mix with many others that will develop along the way as America changes the way food materials are produced, gathered, and sold, and it pioneers food processing, packaging, and marketing. All the way down to me bringing up Cookie Monster last episode and his sometimes food, and then talking of the deserving, physically laboring colonist chopping wood for hog butchering time. These are very old ideas in America. How they got from all the way back there to now and hanging out in our brains rent-free, it's often unseen and will be covered in future episodes. But next week, I'm backing away from the shaming of the Puritans and the dives into religious philosophy. Instead, it's back to tasty consumables. I'll introduce you to the bonkers, multi-threaded origins of American rum. Just how exciting can industrial waste be? We'll see the highs, the lows, and the invocation of demons. It's all there. Thanks for listening. Before I get to my usual credits, the end of the 17th century is approaching, as is the first birthday of the podcast, which means there will be a question show. This will be in about 4 or 5 weeks. I still have to map out the last few end-of-the-century topics to be certain. But this gives you time to send me any questions, ask me about something I glossed over too fast, or overlooked entirely. You can drop them in my Twitter, my email, or even on the Facebook page if that's the place you're most comfortable. I look forward to your questions before we dive into the 18th century. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also on the show's Twitter bio @THOA Food and in the show description.